You mentioned people being interested in what you're eating. And this is something I'm sure that changes and pivots over time. But let's talk about where you're at now with when you break your fast, what you're eating, and then we can use again that as a platform to dive into different areas and talk about different aspects of fasting and diet.
Yeah, I mean, right now I use the term carnivore-ish, and it's really because I eat a lot of animal-based protein. That's what works really well for my body. Whether it's bison or steak or pork or chicken or fish. I mean, I like to kind of mix things up. I really genuinely like vegetables, which is why I could never be full carnivore again. And the tail end of that is I was full carnivore after being hospitalized because nothing else worked for my digestive system. But I really like vegetables, and I actually like fruit, and I tolerate both really well. I do better on a leaner diet, so leaner cuts of meat, leaner cuts of fish. I don't do as well with a lot of healthy fats. So when I do have healthy fats, it's smaller portions, and that's just what makes me unique. And that's been a lot of trial and error over the last several years. So when I break a fast, I'm going to sit down with, today I had grilled bison and I had some hard boiled eggs. I'm going through an egg phase. I intermittently kind of go through an egg phase. I think I must need more choline in my diet. So I sat down and had a bison burger. I had 3 deviled eggs. I had some leftover broccolini, and that was my lunch, or when I broke my fast. And that to me is perfect. And I'll eat another bolus of food later this afternoon after, playing my mom role. But that's kind of what I've been working best with right now is a good amount of protein. I would say 100 to 110 grams of protein a day for me, just based on my ideal body weight. And then, as much non-starchy vegetables as I want. And I've been experimenting more with fruit. I had not been eating a lot of fruit for a while, but right now I'm in a berry phase. Lots of raspberries and blueberries are what I really enjoy. Even just green bananas. Like, I think bananas have been largely vilified, but I love a just green banana, and it probably makes me sound like a total weirdo, but that's when it's a lot less starchy. There's just something about it. Like, it's literally when it's just gone from greenish to a little bit yellow, that's perfect for me. And those are the things that work really well for me. And I always encourage people to experiment. See, are your satiety cues kind of met with the amount of protein that you're eating? For me, I am so full when I'm done eating. There's no way I could eat more food. It's interesting when I travel, though, I will say with full disclosure, I've started ordering a second thing of protein. Like, I was in a restaurant last month and I had a naked burger on my plate, and I looked at the waitress and I said, "Can I get a side of shrimp or some chicken?" Because this burger was so small. I'm not hitting that 40, 50, 60 grams of protein in that meal. So there's been a great deal of experimentation, but that's what works best for me right now. And definitely breaking my fast is with a protein dense meal, usually with some carbohydrate, but usually in the form of vegetables.
So you've really hit home the importance of protein when you break your fast. Let's talk about why that is. I think it was 40, 50, 60 grams. Why do you aim for so high? What is that doing for you?
Yeah. So for me, I'm very protective of my muscle. And the one thing that I have learned from being friends with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon over the last several years is that protein is so incredibly important. Our protein needs actually increase with age. It's not that they go away. My protein needs probably as a 51-year-old female are much more than they were even 10 years ago. So protein is important for me because I'm aiming for 110 grams a day. And I kind of teach people that you want more protein than you probably realize. So I want to make sure that each meal has 50 to 60 grams of protein. That's ideally what I'm shooting for. Number 1, for supportive muscle protein synthesis. Number 2, for satiety, because the one thing that people may or may not realize is that as you are losing estrogen in perimenopause towards the tail end and into menopause, and as this hormone called follicular stimulating hormone is going up, it will drive the need for protein needs will continue to increase. If you don't get your protein need met, guess what? You're going to crave fat and carbohydrates. And it's important to understand that those things tend to be hyperpalatable, meaning if I sit down and have a bunch of chips and guacamole, although delicious, that is not going to give my body the macros that it needs to be able to continue to build muscle. What's important to understand about muscle is that muscle helps with insulin sensitivity. So as we are losing muscle north of 40, this process of sarcopenia, our bodies are effectively replacing lean muscle tissue with adipose tissue. Adipose tissue, although, if you're looking at a filet mignon, which is, lean muscle, a ribeye, although delicious, that's not what we want our muscles to turn into, because we start to lose muscle insulin sensitivity, where we'll become more insulin resistant. There are all these hormonal changes that are occurring, especially for women as they are transitioning from perimenopause to menopause. And so for me, it's helping individuals understand, whether you're a man or a woman, andropause is a real thing, menopause is a real thing. And the way to get ahead of that is to make sure you're eating enough protein, you're getting high quality sleep, and you're lifting heavy things. And that always seems to be a triggering kind of trio, because people will say, I don't want to lift weights. And I'm like, I don't care if you do body weight exercise. I've got my, 76-year-old mom doing body weight exercise, and she's, slowly kind of improving upon her sarcopenic muscle. But it's helpful to understand, this is where me as an intermittent fasting expert, I will differentiate from the longevity experts, because to me, it is far more important to be hitting those protein metrics than it is to be having just one meal a day, than it is to be continuing to lose muscle mass as I get older. I think that on a lot of different levels, these frank conversations are important so that people understand those hormones that I'm referring to: estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, whether it's cortisol, melatonin. As these things are changing throughout our lifetime, they can positively or negatively impact how we are aging, whether that's accelerated. If you're losing muscle and you're losing insulin sensitivity, you're increasing inflammation, you're increasing oxidative stress. We have a whole generation of providers and also women who are fearful to talk about hormones, let alone talk about replacing hormones. And so helping people understand very transparently, because I'm very comfortable talking about what I've done that's worked and what I've done that has not worked. I think it's helpful for people just to start the conversation with, if you want to maintain insulin sensitivity and you want to maintain lean muscle, you have to change your relationship with protein, and you have to change your relationship with the types of exercise that you're doing, and also really focusing on sleep. And those three things can be very, very helpful to ensure that you remain metabolically healthy. And I think that's something that you and I really share, is a passion for helping people understand what are the things you can do to help support your health as you're getting older.
One of my favorite Quicksilver Scientific products is their liposomal vitamin C. It's great for immune support, collagen production, and antioxidant protection. The liposome is a great delivery system for effectively getting the vitamin C into your body. Save 15% by clicking the link in the description. And now back to the show. Well, I definitely want to take some time later on in our conversation to talk about metabolic health. And you mentioned insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. I really want to get into those as well. But before we do, I want to make sure we really get into some of the nuances of what you're eating and when you're eating. So we kind of have an idea now of the food piece, but let's just go right through your day. I think that'd be helpful, and talk about what you're having before you break your fast, when you break your fast. You mentioned exercise, that being a big piece of all of this. When are you exercising? I really want us, before we get into the next piece, to have a good feeling for what a day looks like.
Okay, so this is a typical day in my life. Obviously, it's a great question. I'm happy to answer it. But remember, this is what works for me at this stage in my life. So this may not work for someone else. So I'm typically up between 5 and 6 a.m. Usually the first thing I do is I get my dogs out for a walk. And it's important that I get out like as the sun is kind of rising. So my dogs get anywhere from a 1.5 to 2 mile walk. And then I'm getting sunlight exposure on my retinas. I'm not wearing sunglasses, depending on how hot or cold it is. That's how long the walk is. I come home, I feed them. I have teenagers, they feed themselves and go off to school. And then usually whatever exercise I'm doing that day, whether it's a day where I'm doing more recovery work, or if it's a day I'm lifting, I try to aim to lift 2 to 3 days a week minimum. I also really like doing Pilates. I probably should be doing that twice a week, because I actually mentally that's good for me, because it's challenging, but in different ways. I get quite a bit of walking in. So for me, I'm aiming to have 7,000 to 8,000 steps done in the morning, because that kind of allows me to kind of gauge how much more physical activity I need during the day. after I've gotten my workout done. I really love laying on a PEMF mat. And if anyone's wondering what that is, it's a mat that has ions that are actually helping to support the mitochondria. It's incredibly relaxing. And for me, it kind of reminds my body, depending on the settings, okay, this is kind of a little bit of a recovery before I take a shower. So usually in the shower by 9 o'clock in the morning, shower, get myself ready for the day, whatever it is I'm doing, household stuff, if it's laundry or other things. I am always, as soon as I get up in the morning, I'm drinking water. I have a little bit of mild dysautonomia. I don't have POTS, so I don't have postural orthostatic hypotension that a lot of individuals do. But I've always craved electrolytes, and I never knew why. And so I've been working with a new functional medicine doctor, and the first thing he said, he just mentioned a couple things about my history, and he's like, I think you actually have mild dysautonomia and some degree of hypermobility, and I've got some gut stuff. And so he said, you kind of have created this triad that he sees. And so for me, electrolytes are an important part of my day. I drink them throughout the day. Obviously, in a fasted state, it's the unflavored variety. But I add a lot of, like when I tell you a lot of electrolytes, a lot. And so I'm drinking that all the way throughout the day. I usually now break my fast a little earlier than I used to. Usually 9:30, 10:30, 11 is usually my sweet spot, depending on what's on my calendar. That's when I'll sit down and have 50, 60 grams of protein. I'll have those non-starchy vegetables. My one vice in life is dark chocolate. And so I allow myself to have a little bit of dark chocolate every day. And I have zero shame about that. There's a lot of things I don't eat, but I love dark chocolate. And that's something that makes me happy. Get a little bit of a dopamine hit, and then I can kind of tackle my day. And most of my day is working in my business. If it's a Monday through Friday, I usually start to kind of gear down around 3:30 because I have a kiddo that has to be picked up from school. And I may or may not eat before I pick him up or eat after. It just really depends on how the day is structured. On the weekends, we're very diligent about family meals. During the week, it's because we have so many different schedules, sports events, things. It's kind of a grab and go culture, which used to not be the case. But now that I have teenagers, we've had to kind of make some accommodations. So that last meal could be at 4 o'clock. It could be at 5 o'clock. It could be at 6 o'clock. And again, I'll have the same kind of plug and play, 50 to 60 grams of protein, more non-starchy vegetables, lots of water. During my feeding window, I will have electrolytes with some stevia in them, and I'm okay with that. I love fresh squeezed lemon in my water. I'm happy to talk about all the electrolytes I take because I try a couple different ways to get them all in. I can tell by my HRV, my heart rate variability, how much hydration I've gotten. And so that's a typical day. And then usually I'm gearing down for bed. I like to be upstairs, maybe not per se in bed, 9-ish. I like to be in bed, lights out by 9:30 or 10. This week was unusual that I had, my mom was in town. My mom doesn't go to bed early. And then my older son had a lacrosse game. And so I think I was in bed at like 10:45. And I definitely feel differently when I get up, when I go to bed later. So that's a typical day. 2 usually large boluses of food. Yes, I'm very cognizant to ensure I'm getting plenty of food in. And some days, I would say the average day, I get 2 large boluses of food, which sounds terrible, 2 large meals. And then at least one day a week, I refer to as a refeeding day. And refeeding makes me sound like I'm an animal in the zoo, but it's really a day I will have a bit more protein. I will account for another meal. And it could be, maybe that's a day I have a protein shake and then 2 large meals. Or maybe it's a day I just sit down and I'm kind of going through this egg phase, as I mentioned. Maybe I have four eggs, or maybe I have an omelet. Maybe I have 5 eggs. Just depends on how hungry I am. But it's definitely with the understanding that I'm very kind of aware of how my body feels, how's my recovery from workouts, how's my sleep quality. But the hydration and protein are 2 very consistent things that I really actively work towards. I have a 60-ounce glass pitcher that sits on my counter, and that's how I'm able to kind of get a sense for how much water I'm consuming throughout the day. So the expectation is by the time I go to bed, I have finished that. So I'm drinking it throughout the day, which I think is really just very important for me. As an example, I was out in Denver. I live on the East Coast, but I was out in Denver last month. And my mom grew up in Denver. I've gone to Denver maybe not hundreds of times, many times throughout my lifetime because I have family there. I had an altitude headache. I struggled. My HRV was in the toilet. My sleep quality was off. And it was because I could not catch back up for the hydration piece. And so for 3 days, I had the headache, the hydration, electrolytes. I was doubling up on electrolytes. And it was interesting to see that at altitude, I was really struggling because I travel quite a bit and I don't normally have that much trouble. But it was really interesting to see the net impact on how I felt because I just couldn't get ahead of the curve. But generally speaking, that's kind of how my days are structured. Now, if I'm traveling, obviously different. Weekends are different because it's so important for us to sit down with our children and eat. And it's a slower pace. Like during the week, it's very purposeful. It's like, okay, I have 30 minutes. I'm going to sit down and eat my meal. And I think it's very important that I don't rush through eating. I don't like to eat in my car. I don't like to eat at my desk. I think it's important to just unplug. Maybe I read a book. Just very, very important to make sure my body is relaxed when I'm consuming food so that it can properly kind of assimilate and break down what I'm eating.
This is great. I love all the detail here. I think we went over some of this last time we talked, but this obviously is always changing, like I mentioned before, and we're getting into all kinds of detail we haven't covered. Couple areas I really want to make sure we dive deeper into, one being the electrolyte piece. They kept coming up, and I don't remember specifically them coming up last time. So I'm curious, is this a newer addition for you or just something you're making more of a priority in the last bit? And then it sounds like you're having them throughout the day. Are you drinking plain water too, or is it electrolytes all the time?
It is electrolytes all the time. It's interesting. Even before intermittent fasting, because of cardiology, because of my background and knowing what I knew about my patients, I was like, I would recommend salting their food, which was completely contrary to what we're typically telling our patients, high quality salt. But I crave salt and my adrenals are healthy. That's not the issue. I think I've always needed them. And I intuitively understood that. Because this new physician that I'm working with, he laughed when we asked me what I ate in a day. And he said, I think it's really interesting that you are this attuned to your body. You understand how much better you feel when you're consuming electrolytes as opposed to not. So when I look at my day, I literally have, I don't know if you've ever heard of Quinton ampules. So you can get hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic water. They're little ampules that you break them off. I add that to my water, in an unfed state because there's nothing that's flavoring them. It's pretty benign. I add element to my water in an unfed and a fed state. So obviously the unsweetened element is pretty salty. So that has to be diluted in a lot of water. But yeah, all day long I'm drinking electrolytes. I even have other trace minerals that I'll add. And what I found is interesting is that I sleep better. My HRV is better. I'm a lot more alert when I'm hydrating like this all during the day. But I understand now that there's something unique about my physiology that I actually need more than the average person. And someone had once said, well, is it because you're low carb, because you've got these renal losses of sodium? And I said, well, now I wouldn't say I'm consistently low carbohydrate. For listeners, if they're familiar, when you go lower carbohydrate, you're actually breaking down and depleting glycogen stores. And with glycogen being broken down, you'll get renal losses of sodium and other electrolytes. And I said, I can tell if I'm really low carb, I can tell in my body, I'll just start urinating more often. I said, that's not what this is about. I think this is just what's unique to me and my lifestyle. But I find that fasting in general, if someone's fasting and not using electrolytes, it can be a big game changer. People just feel better. They're more mentally clear. They have less cramping. And so the longer I've done this, the more I've just realized is that this might be my magical unicorn properties, is that I consume a lot of electrolytes throughout the day, but not in a way that's raised my blood pressure or not in a way that inhibits my ability to go to bed at night. I don't wake up to urinate. So I know I'm hitting the right threshold for me. But I acknowledge if someone were to see, because my mother was asking a lot of questions, if someone were to see what I do in a given day, they would probably be surprised.
You mentioned Element there. They're a longtime sponsor of the show. I'm actually drinking Element right now. Big fan. How many packs would you go through a day?
At least 3, sometimes 4. And that's on top of Quinton ampules. That's on top of trace minerals. I've even got my My physician even has me on some vitamin C. So I've got like a lot of mineral support just in general. And to his credit, actually, since he added a couple new mineral supplements, I actually feel really good. So I'm like, okay, this is actually working towards that. But when I was in Denver, I was consuming probably 8 a day because I was doubling up because I knew what was happening. I was like, my body's dehydrated and it's not acclimating to altitude as readily as I thought it would. I was like, okay, I will never be, probably not going to Machu Picchu anytime soon, which is even a higher elevation. But, as to your point, I think that for each one of us, it's finding that sweet spot. I have some people that will just consume one element a day, and that's as much as they tolerate. And so I think it's the power of the N of one, and just understanding that, each one of us has kind of like unique needs that, if we're tuning into what our body's trying to communicate, can really make a big difference. And for me, electrolytes are total game changers. So when I travel, especially when I travel overseas or I'm doing longer trips, that's how I can kind of gauge how much water I'm consuming. So I always bring that glass container, which, to my teenagers is so embarrassing. They're like, oh, there goes mom with her electrolytes. I'm like, that's right.
So just to make sure I'm clear, this big container has the Quinton ampules, which is something I'm going to look into. I haven't heard of them before. The Element, and then trace minerals. What kind of trace minerals?
So it's just a product that has, bioavailable potassium, sodium, magnesium, and chloride. And the trace minerals are things like manganese and lithium. I take a separate vitamin C supplement. And you may or may not know, vitamin C is one of these supplements that if you take too much, it can actually give you diarrhea. So it's like this. I take a capsule because the powders, I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. It's a little less specific. So, for me, it's finding what's the right combination for me. But I acknowledge when I say to other people, this is what I do, it's like, wow, that's a lot of different steps. However, because I feel good, that's why it just reinforces like, this is physician sanctioned. So objectively, my physician has signed off on this with the acknowledgement that he's like, you've figured out for yourself what you need, like your little like cocktail of electrolytes that you consume during the day that work best for you. Oh, and I love lemon. So I have a lot of lemon squeezed into my water. For some reason, that's like perfect.
And what do you use for a base of the water? Is it like a Berkey water filter system or reverse osmosis? Just since we've gotten into the nuances here, let's get the full picture.
So it's interesting that you asked that question. So it's always filtered water, but I had our water tested, and my new functional medicine doctor wanted an even more involved test. There was like 8 different vials of water that had to be tested. And so I'm still waiting to get that report because he wanted that report to then determine what we were going to get. I just wanted to get a whole house aquasana system. My husband didn't want anything on our counter. So our Berkey did not make its way from our last house. And so we're kind of in this gray area right now, waiting to figure that out. The first test that we did, which he felt like didn't test enough things, showed us some cadmium. So cadmium is a heavy metal. And he felt like there was probably, the area of Virginia that I live in there's probably a strong likelihood there's more heavy metals than what we realize. So to this date, I don't yet have that report. I'm told it should be back next week. It's like takes like 3 weeks to test all these things. But literally there's this massive box that shows up that you then have to put all these 8 vials of things, out of the kitchen sink, out of this other sink. We have a brand new house. So I don't anticipate we're going to have any contaminants that were related to copper pipes or things like that. So it's been a very interesting journey. And I just say this really humbly, like as a clinician, going through this process has been very interesting.
Let's talk about the stevia piece. You mentioned when you're in your fasting window, you're having the unflavored electrolytes, which opens up the bigger question, stevia, how do you feel about it in general? And then, because I'm somebody, I mentioned the Element big fan, I have the flavored ones. I actually don't consume the unflavored ones only because I like all the different flavors, even when I'm fasting. So this is probably going to be a new piece for me to implement when I'm fasting to get the unflavored ones. Why does that matter?
Well, I think this is there's definitely debate, certainly on social media. Some people will say, well, it doesn't evoke a blood sugar response, so it's irrelevant. But I think more about a cephalic phase insulin response. So this physiologic response to things that are sweet on our tongue. And when I talk about a clean fast incorporates things that I'm pretty certain are not going to evoke an insulin response in the body. And so I think this is very nuanced. Obviously, if you are metabolically healthy, insulin sensitive, I don't think you really have to worry about the nuances of having a little bit of stevia in a fasting window. But most of my people that follow me and are in programs are not metabolically healthy, or they're kind of teetering on that edge. And I do think it can be a differentiator between, clean fasting versus maybe it's a little nuanced type of fasting. So I think for an individual, if you're insulin sensitive, probably not a big deal to have a packet of stevia sweetened element. I want to be really clear about that. I don't beat myself up. If I want orange salt, I'm going to have it, and I'm not going to feel guilty or badly about it. I think that it's important to just understand the context when we're talking about non-nutritive sweeteners. So there was a study that was done in Cell last fall, kind of looking at non-nutritive sweeteners. And it was in a mouse study, and it was looking at saccharin, which made me laugh because I was like, was it like 1980s, like Tab soda? That's like what my grandmother used to consume. Like, who's using saccharin? They were comparing that with aspartame and sucralose. And so to me, aspartame and sucralose are these artificial sweeteners. Those I think I would definitely not recommend people consume. They're in a lot of beverages. They're in a lot of shakes. They're in a lot of bars that are out there that seem to be kind of benign. And I say seem to be benign, and I'll put that in air quotes. And then there was also stevia that was used in this study. And the kind of first thing that it was looking at in a mouse model was how do these sweeteners impact oral glucose tolerance? And within 28 days, there was a negative net impact on oral glucose tolerance, and there was a negative net impact on the gut microbiome. Now, this is a mouse or mice. This is not a human, but when we're looking at animal models, we could likely kind of extrapolate that there could be the potentiality of negative interactions on the gut microbiome and our insulin sensitivity or glucose tolerance for that matter. But I don't kind of put stevia in the same bucket as saccharin, sucralose, aspartame. I want to be really clear about that. And I think if you're having 3 or 4 element a day, that's very different than someone that's having a lot of highly processed, hyperpalatable foods with a lot of artificial sweeteners in them. And I think it's also, are you someone that's very susceptible to artificial sweeteners? Some people, it just drives the desire for more and more and more and more and more. And I think for individuals that are susceptible, they have to really abstain or really limit their consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners along with traditional sweeteners. And so it really begs the question of, you have to know yourself. I always like Vinnie Tortorich because he has, the no sugar, no grains. That's kind of his mindset. And I was at a talk that he gave last year. We both spoke at an event, and someone said, "What's your favorite artificial sweetener?" And he said, "None." He said, because all you're doing is chasing a problem with another problem. Meaning, if you've got a sugar problem, you're better off limiting or eliminating the sugar than trying to find the latest and greatest, whether it's monk fruit, a thyrotol, stevia, etc. And so I think we really just have to know ourselves. So again, just kind of getting back to the original intent of answering the question was, if you're not insulin sensitive, if you're dealing with, hyperinsulinemia, or you've got a high blood sugar, then it probably matters what you're consuming in a fasted state, significantly so. If you're metabolically healthy, you're insulin sensitive, I wouldn't worry about a package of element. And I'm just using element as the example. Obviously, there's other things that we could use. But I think that's really how it gets really nuanced. And do I on occasion have orange element in a fasted state and feel fine? Absolutely. But I think it's always in the context. But for me personally, I'm having a combination of unflavored and flavored orange salt. That's my favorite. Throughout my day. And so I think that it's really big picture. Like, I think sometimes people can get so fixated on minutia that they miss the big picture. And the big picture is, are you insulin sensitive? The answer is yes. Then worry a whole lot less. If you're not, then you got to work on those things, because it can make a big difference in the success that you have.
As you're going through what you eat, when you eat, and you gave us kind of a typical week saying things were a bit different on the weekend, one of the things that jumped out at me was the fact that you have this one day throughout the week where you actually up the protein. And for a lot of us, it already, I'm sure, sounded like you're having quite a bit of protein on a typical day. One thing you didn't get into, though, is why you do that. So, what's the reason for that once a week?
Well, I think because I've been fasting for so many years now. It's kind of, you can make the argument I could have more carbohydrates that day or I can have more protein, but it's designed to kind of stimulate a little bit more muscle protein synthesis, but also remind my body I'm not trying to starve it. Oftentimes women come to me, and I'll use a woman as an example. Perfect example is a middle-aged woman. She's weight loss resistant. If a little bit of fasting is good, more is better. They've been doing OMAD for years. They're mad at me because I'm telling them they're not eating enough food. They're going to break their metabolism effectively. And we have to kind of reverse diet, go back to eating more food because they've gotten to a point where they're completely plateaued, but they've not been eating enough food for years and years and years. And what ends up happening is their body's like, well, heck, I'm not going to get much food today, so I'm not going to burn any extra calories. There's no point in doing that. And so I think it really begs the conversation about making sure you're eating enough food. So for me, it's really kind of giving myself a little, maybe it's 100 calories more. It's not a ton more protein, but kind of pushing that metric up and working with women that have effectively gotten to a point where they're eating 800 calories a day, maybe 500 calories a day if they're eating one meal. They've just gotten to a point where they've widgeted down so much. That can be destructive. And this is when there's this nuance of some degree of disordered eating, that can play a role. I don't know if you're seeing that in some of the, talking to some of the guests, if they're seeing similar situations with patients. I have some people who are pathologically fearful to eat more than one meal a day. And I always say one meal a day is fine around holiday, vacation, you ate too much, you don't feel good, you're bloated. One meal a day is not a sustainable strategy to be able to hit those protein macros, to not end up losing muscle mass at the expense of insulin sensitivity. And so for me, a lot of why I do that is to kind of push that threshold up. Now, have I ever gotten to a point where I had to kind of adjust my macros and make sure I was pushing the envelope? That's why that protein piece is so important. I don't want my body to think that I'm trying to be neglectful or I don't track macros, I don't track calories, but I generally have a very good sense of how much I'm eating. I'll give you a good example. 2 days ago, super busy day, didn't stop and have lunch, totally unusual for me. My son had a lacrosse game, didn't eat enough for dinner. And by the next day, I was like, I'm grumpy. I know I'm grumpy because I didn't eat enough food. I definitely can't exist like that. So your body will definitely let you know. But I think from the perspective of if you think you probably aren't eating enough food, you probably aren't. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And how many individuals will share with me across social media, they've been doing OMAD for years, males and females. And I'm like, you're probably in a significant caloric deficit, and that could be detrimental. And so really having those honest conversations, even if the potentiality exists that it's going to be provocative or make someone uncomfortable. Or, I used to be the co-host of another podcast, and we would sometimes get those questions, and I would just say, well, if you don't think you're eating enough, you probably aren't. And so I think more often that we've already answered the questions for ourselves without having to ask it. It's like, we already know, we just need the validation.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
And so people don't like me to talk about this, but I'm going to, because I think it's so important to understand that if you are weight loss resistant, what you eat